Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, brings an end to all of our formal presentations. Unfortunately, Colonel Brian MacDonald, who would normally do the summation, had to be recalled to Toronto early this morning for family matters, and Julie Lindhout has agreed to do the summation portion. Julie?
I can't do it with the dramatic flair that Brian would have brought to this, but I think we have had an extremely useful, extremely informative day. It was exactly 1 week ago that I was in Tirana, Albania, at the 57th Annual Assembly of the Atlantic Treaty Association, which is the umbrella organization that the Atlantic Councils in all the NATO member and partner countries belong to. And it was interesting to reflect on how the key issues and themes of that assembly are very similar to the key issues and themes that we discussed today. There was a lot of talk about the challenges of NATO, how much, and it was particularly interesting in that Southeastern European environment to hear about how much NATO means to those countries. People like us in Canada, we often take it for granted because NATO has been part of our defense psyche, our thinking for so many years. Most of us have never known anything else. But to a country like Albania and the representatives from other countries, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, all the people who were there, it was something that was very, very different, very living. And yet the ideas that we discussed were exactly very, very similar. We heard statements similar to Chris Alexander this morning talking about how important NATO was and how we must not abandon Afghanistan. That was a theme that really came up there. We had a woman from Afghanistan speaking very eloquently, a member of parliament in Afghanistan, speaking very eloquently about the difference that ISAF had made. Again, it's not something that we focus on a lot, but to somebody who actually lives there, it makes a huge difference. And that, again, I think was also something that Chris Alexander was emphasizing this morning, and certainly by his recommendation of Terry Glavin's book, I think that he wanted us to understand that. We also looked at some of the challenges, and particularly Dr. Baranek really outlined how very, very complex the situation is in the whole region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and how the whole notion, how we need to be prepared for it to be a generational kind of thing to get through all of that. When they have such a low starting point for this generation in Afghanistan. And yet, when you think about what Afghanistan was like in the 60s, it was probably a leader in that area. And so if we can help them get back to that situation, as a former Afghan ambassador to Canada, His Excellency Omar Samad, said at one of the presentations when he spoke to us about 4 years ago at this conference, he talked again, if you can help bring Afghanistan back to where it actually has already been, that can be that is very exhilarating, the thought that that might happen. However, as we learned today, that's not exactly an easy thing to think about. We talked about some of the difficulties, and again, even with something, we talked a lot about sharing and pooling and interoperability and working together, it is absolutely the only way to go ahead in the future. We all recognize that, whether it's in the civilian military field, whether it's from a Canadian perspective, whether it's in the international perspective in NATO, whichever perspective it is, we do have to work together. But again, we heard how very, very complex that is, because Kevin Rex talked about, the elements that they had to address in cooperating when he showed us that slide with the various elements about how difficult it is, how each group has to adjust, and how you have to have a certain number of trade-offs and so on. It isn't as simple. It isn't simply to say, cooperate. Stop competing, work together. How do you make that actually happen on the ground? And I think that, again, was a significant problem that we talked about. The same thing with EU-NATO relations. Both NATO and EU have wanted to work together. They've genuinely wanted to work together for quite a long time. But, again, how do you operationalize that? How do you really make it happen? When you have different cultures, different mindsets, different countries involved, different capabilities. And then, again, there is the whole Russia question, which Professor Dudkevich explained so well to us today. That was also, again, a theme last week, because there actually is an Atlantic Council in Russia, and there were representatives at the Assembly who spoke about some of the situations, some of the things happening, and people commented on that. Again, it's a matter of perception. We can't understand why the Russians are so upset about missile defense, which we keep telling them is not directed at them. They can't understand how we can be so naive as to think that they don't have a right to be somewhat suspicious about things. So it's something that really keeps coming up. Ambassador Kolinda Grabar-Kitarovich was actually in person at that assembly, and she basically said a lot of the same things that she said today. The whole direction that NATO is moving into, the planning process that is happening in advance of the Chicago summit, where, again, some of these whole issues of cooperation and coherence and so on are going to be developed, and hopefully there will be details about how that is to happen. And then it was very interesting to actually hear about some of the practical aspects of what that means to Canada and what that involves in the planning, as Colonel Irwin outlined this afternoon. Because, again, we have to get into a very different collaborative mindset. And he was quite right to talk about how Canada was leading in that aspect, because as a Canadian, I felt very proud at that assembly. Because a lot of people talked about Canada showing some leadership. As a matter of fact, in the final analysis, one of the presenters who talked about the way forward said, we should all be more like Canada, which was a fantastic statement to hear. But our work there, the work of our PRT in Kandahar, our leadership role there, is very much recognized. Also, the situation in our country, where we have people of different origins, different birth places, all more or less living together in a much greater, sometimes we wonder whether it's entirely as harmonious as we'd like it to be, but according to some of the European countries, compared to what's happening in their countries right now, our situation seems to be much better in that respect. So again, that was another situation where they suggested that we should be more like Canada. And one of the things that they talked a lot about was this whole notion of sharing and pooling and interoperability. And the question that kept popping up in my mind was, okay, but how do you make that happen? What are some of the specific examples of how that happens? And I was delighted with the presentation by John Graham this afternoon, because that is an example of how you can make some of that happen. This is a project, this whole simulation on the communication strategy, the training process. It's not just something that is internal to Canada, but it is something that is being exported and is working together. It's working at NATO, and it has great potential to work further at NATO. And then finally, Vice Admiral Donaldson brought it all back together again when he started out by saying, Canada needs NATO as a force multiplier for our own defense capabilities, but NATO also needs Canada. And Canada has made a significant contribution to NATO. So I'd like to leave you with that thought, how important it is that we continue to learn about what goes on in our international efforts, which in this case are very much the focus of our discussion as it applies to NATO, and what we can do, what we can expect from NATO, what we can expect from our country, and how to energize people to appreciate that more. Because when you go to places like Southeastern Europe, you begin to realize what a fantastic job the whole alliance has actually done and what it continues to mean for people. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you for having come to this conference. We will be at some point distributing the proceedings, and hopefully we will put out another DVD, as you saw, of our spring conference that we have here. And we hope you will join us for a little while still at the reception. Thank you.